See, bottom left. Yeah. If you look at the big screen, I've done it. Bottom left there, mute.
Morning, gents.
Morning, how are you doing?
Yeah, good, thanks.
Good.
Charlie, just so you know, you probably already know, I'm going to make a clarification about Miss Greengrass evidence about Little Port. So I'll clarify the position. If the inspector wants to hear from the horse's mouth, so to speak, I'm happy for Barbara to make the point as well.
Okay.
Right, good morning, everybody. It's 9:30 and the inquiry is resumed for day 3. We're going to be moving on today to hear from the appellant's planning witness. Before we do that, there's a few documents which have been submitted, so I'll just read those. Firstly, a costs application submitted by the council. So that's in writing. Has the appellant seen that?
Yes, we did. We saw it late yesterday. First.
Right, okay, thank you. So obviously I'll be looking for a response to that application before we close.
Yes.
And I wonder whether, given that that's in writing, whether you could consider the response could be in writing as well and used from the past.
Absolutely, sir. Absolutely. Yeah, we'll do that, and we'll do that by tomorrow.
Yes, okay, thank you. Mr. Smythe, you're content that we deal with it in writing, are you?
So I defer to you and Mr. Banner.
Thank you. Right.
Certainly, sir, I don't want to say anything more. It is what it is. Yeah.
Yes, okay, that's fine. Well, I'm just trying to establish whether anyone thinks that I need to hear the application orally, but it doesn't sound like it. Okay, good, thank you. I've also had a note on affordable housing supply from the appellant, which is seeking to bring matters up to date following the round table session. Has the council seen that?
Yes, I can't say I've read it yet, but yes, we've received it, sir. I don't object.
Okay, thank you. Well, if anything comes of that, then let me know, but I think it is quite a short document, just bringing matters up to date. Okay, and then documents that I haven't got yet, the revised housing land supply position from both parties, again, following on from the round table session. Could I just be updated on that, please?
It's in hand. I think it's in near final form, and I expect you'll get it this morning.
Okay, is that going to be an agreed position between the parties? Yes. Okay. All right. Thank you. And then finally, the final version of the Section 106 agreement.
Yes, that also is imminent.
Right.
I know I've been saying that all week, so it really is imminent.
Yes. Well, we're going to be coming on to discuss it today, yes, so yes, it needs to be very imminent.
No, absolutely.
Okay. Right. Any other housekeeping matters then before we proceed?
So just one. Sorry, Mr. Banner.
Mr. Smythe, if you go first.
Sorry. I've got a correction to make, or rather, if you want to hear from Miss Greengrass herself, but just to tee up the point. So you recall, in answer to a question from you, Ms. Greengrass explained why one could distinguish the council approach in this case to the Little Port case, you may recall, and her evidence was at that stage we didn't have a 5-year supply, and it was it's an allocation and emerging plan which the council at that stage was giving weight. That is not correct. the position is there was a resolution to grant, and then about 2 years later, there was a Section 106. So the date of decision was about 2 years after the resolution. At the date of decision, there was a 5-year supply, but there was an allocation in the draft plan, which the council was giving weight. By the time the planning permission was issued, about 2 years later, the position had reversed. So at that stage, at the date the planning permission was issued, there wasn't a 5-year supply, but the emerging plan had been kicked into touch. I'm sorry for that confusion. If you want to hear from Miss Greengrass directly, I'm happy to call her, but I hope that provides the correct position. And I'm sorry that there was confusion, as I say.
Right, okay. Well, thank you for the clarification. Could you just repeat it for me, though, please, just to make sure that I'm following it? So you're saying the actual decision wasn't issued until 2 years after the committee. Was that what you said? Yeah,
about. It may be 18 months, but yes.
And by that time, the council did have a 5-year housing land supply.
No, so opposite. So date of decision, there wasn't a 5-year supply, but the reliance upon the allocation didn't apply because it had now been abandoned. At the date of resolution, when the committee report was written, there was a 5-year supply, but the council was relying upon the allocation.
Right, I see. Thank you. Mr. Banner, does anything arise from that from your perspective?
No, thank you.
Okay, right. Thank you for the clarification then, Mr. Smythe. Did you have something that you wanted to raise, Mr. Banner?
No, I was simply saying that I didn't actually have anything to raise.
Oh, right, okay. Right, okay. Well, I think that's it in terms of housekeeping then. So we can hear from Mr. Hill. So Mr. Banner, if you'd like to introduce him, please.
Thank you, certainly. So Mr. Hill's on screen. You have his background details in the preface to his proof, where you tell us you're Paul Hill, a chartered town planner, a member of the RTPI with an honours degree in geography and a master's degree in town and country planning from the University of Wales and of West of England, respectively. You're a senior director at RPS, having worked for RPS for about 15 years. And you tell us you've been in the planning profession generally for about 31 years, including 16 years in local government, with your last local government role being development plans manager. And you set out some further information about your experience and RPS's role in providing advice to Persimmon on this matter since February 2019. Is all of that information still correct and up to date?
It is, yes.
Excellent, thank you. Now, sir, as is Ms. Greengrass, we'll take, if we may, the evidence and the summary as read. I just want Mr. Hill to highlight a few of the main points of his analysis, starting with page 6 of the proof, paragraph 3.1.1, where you set out the basis of the appellant's case. And do you want to sort of distill the essential strands of your analysis as to why permission should be granted in this case?
Yes, thank you. First, the basis of the case, as you'll see in 3.1, is that I contend the appeal proposals accord with the development plan when read as a whole. Secondly, should our position be agreed with regarding 5-year land supply and all most important policies being out of date and the tilted balance is clearly engaged, and the adverse impacts don't significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits. And thirdly, even when assessed against the proposals under section 38.6, the Planning Act, flat planning balance, in my view, so there are significant material considerations and public benefits which outweigh any conflict with growth to a policy that don't consider to be up to date and with reduced weight.
Thank you. And then looking at the second, we probably don't need to touch on, in a scenario where the tilted balance applies, that position is agreed. But in the context of the first strand of your argument, plan as a whole, and the third, other material considerations in the event there's non-accordance with the plan, I want to look at the sole conflict alleged by the council, growth 2. And have you seen any evidence from the council which assesses the harm or the extent of harm, if any, underlying the policy conflict, as opposed to simply reiterating that there is a matter of fact, a policy conflict?
No, I haven't. I've just seen it's a point of principle on the consideration of the extent of the harm.
And if we go to your proof at section 5.1 point, well, if we go firstly to page 42, 5.1.7, where you look at the purposes of growth 2, and then page 44, 5.1.19, the harm to the purposes of the policy in this case. What's your analysis as to whether in the particular circumstances of this site and this development, allowing the appeal would cause real harm to the purposes of the strict control provided for by growth 2?
Yes, thank you. I address it, the purpose of growth 2, page 42 of my proof. And then I go on page 44 to address the harm to the policy. The purpose of growth 2 is addressed in some detail. I've carefully considered my various aspects. I probably don't need to go too much over that much detail, but it's clearly linked to growth 1 as a development strategy policy to deliver the in relation to housing applications, the housing provision set out in the plan. That's a principal policy, and also to protect the countryside in relation to Soham's principal purpose is to stop, in effect, sprawl in the countryside at Soham. I then address that in some detail, page 44, 45, and 46, where I go on to consider the level of harm, in effect, that's caused by the development. And that's very much reduced by 2 principal factors. One is the nature of the site itself and the contained nature of the site, where it's encircled on 3 sides to an extent by existing development, and also by the proposals themselves, which are landscape-led and have a very softening effect on that, what Mr. Reynolds' evidence is described as a hard urban edge. Thank you.
So next question, really. How have you had regard to how other inspectors have considered growth 2 in considering the weight to be given to the conflict in the particular circumstances of this case?
Yes, I have. I did hear Mr. Smile on the opening basis say I'd looked at Inspector Chamberlain's report, which I have, and I think, to be fair, Miss Greengrass also has, and undeniably, I think it's probably if you like, the one inspector's report that contains the most level of detail. But also, I think you both referred to Inspector Searson's report. It might be helpful if we take the inspector briefly to both of those decisions.
Yes, that's CD 5.43 is the Inspector Chamberlain one. Do you want to get that out, Mr. Hill, and draw attention to the passages in that decision that you think are of particular relevance?
I'll just wait till everyone's got access to it. I think if we're there, it's paragraphs 51 onwards, and this is Inspector Chamberlain's report. This was an appeal for 33 dwellings in Witchford. The decision was April 2021. At paragraph 51, it's under the heading are the most important policies out of date, and I'll just go through basically some very important sections from his decision. But you'll see in paragraph 51, second sentence, although the council has withdrawn from this document as a statement of common ground, it provided a useful starting point. He went on to consider growth 4 which he said was a relevant policy, but not most important, because it didn't contain or set out a housing requirement for locational strategy for growth, or provide specific guidance on how to consider development proposals at Whitchford. The following paragraph then sets out the most important policies in the local plan. It's Growth 1, Growth 2, HEU 3, ENV 1, ENV 12 were most important. He then looks at the neighbourhood plan. Paragraph 54 basically says Growth 1 is out of date because the housing requirement is specified is out of date. Then says this may have affected the entire spatial strategy, including Growth 2, because settlement boundaries may be too tightly drawn, housing be directed to too few settlements, and there may not be enough allocation. Talked about the council in the process of reviewing Growth 1 to assess this, and then they are currently able to demonstrate a fibre supply. Then the following paragraph says, as a result, and based on the evidence before him, Growth 2 does not carry full weight. Then it says the policy is more about distributing housing numbers. It's a location strategy that guides the majority of the larger settlements. Paragraph 56, last two paragraphs, talks about Growth 2 being seeking to restrict development beyond the settlement bounds, consistent with the objectives in the frame in terms of recognising intrinsic character and beauty of the countryside. And furthermore, because in his review, the restrictions imposed by the policy are not overly stringent due to a comprehensive list of exceptions. On the basis of that, and on balance, he says, policy Growth is up to date, by saying different inspectors have reached different conclusions. You can jump then to paragraph 75, which is the planning balance section of the report. And in the middle of that, just to sum it, basically says the proposals would also be at odds with the location strategy Growth 2. This conflict carries moderate weight because Growth 2 links with the out-of-date policy Growth 1. So that's Inspector Chamberlain. And then the other inspector that myself and Greengrass referred to was Inspector Searson.
That's core document 5.3.
I won't go through it. This was an appeal that came out earlier in September 2020 for 70 dwellings. I think the relevant paragraph, there are other paragraphs that are relevant. The main one is paragraph 65 of that decision, where it says Growth 2 seeks to strictly control development outside of the development elements, having regard to need to protect the countryside. It could be argued that the framework is more holistic in its approach to rural housing, does not couch the need to protect the countryside in stringent terms, although recognition of intrinsic character of the countryside is embedded in paragraph 170. That said, the policy offers a number of exceptions, including affordable housing, the reuse of replacement buildings in accordance with the NPPF, and on balance, consider the policy up to date. So I think I just wanted to go through those just to be very clear what the position is. And hopefully...
Sorry, both of those inspectors refer to as, if you like, the one tempering consideration to the concerns they have at the list of exceptions. Should we have a look at that list of exceptions? And I'm quite keen to have your views as to whether that list truly is extensive in the way described. So could we get up, it's core document 3.1, which is the local plan. And within 3.1, page 25 and 26.
Yeah.
So we have community-based development, affordable housing exception schemes, so the 100% affordable housing subject to HE4, rural workers, care homes, extension replacement of dwellings, gypsy, etc. sites, extensions to businesses, small-scale employment, reuse and replacement of buildings, horse racing, tourism, renewable energy, etc. In the context of what you've discussed, and particularly in the context of residential development, how truly extensive is that list, and does it truly temper the concerns expressed by the inspectors about growth to potentially being otherwise out of date?
Yeah, I mean, it is a lengthy list. I think that's undeniable. But in relation to housing applications, particularly in relation to applications that will deliver additional growth, additional housing, the list isn't extensive, isn't so extensive. I've done some analysis of this. I've looked at all the permissions that have been granted from when the plan became 5 years old until November last year. I've addressed that in paragraph 5.1.15 of my proof. And the analysis behind that is in appendix 3 of my evidence. And the purpose of this is it goes back to both what Inspector Chamberlain and what Inspector Searson said, is that it provides a comprehensive list. And on the basis of that, on balance, they both thought the policy was sufficiently flexible to deliver the housing requirements. What the analysis basically demonstrated, there are a few, if you can look at paragraph 5.15 of my evidence, I've looked through all these decisions at the time. I've got a number of fairly minor changes to that, and I've got the evidence, if it's helpful at all, behind that. But I've been through every single one of the applications. Where it says on the second bullet, out of the 263 dwellings, that doesn't change. It's actually 19 consents and delivering 27 dwellings. So there's a slight change. The reason for that is when we were looking through the description development wasn't quite clear. Look back in detail through the officer's report. There has been some change to that. And that's 7, the next bullet point down, there's 7 permissions from farm worker dwellings, which have delivered 9 dwellings in total. There's still been no affordable housing exceptions sites, and there's been 12 barn conversions delivering 18 units. And what that's done, it's slightly nudged the figures up in paragraph 5.1.17.
It's page 44 of your proof. So just talk us through how you would change the figures in that section of your proof in light of that new information.
Yes, actually, if you look at the paragraph 5.1.16, it says over the 19 months of analysis, this provides just over 1 dwelling a month, should be 17 per annum. So 17, but those exceptions have delivered 17 dwellings on average per annum.
17. And does that change the analysis at all in 516 and 517 as the extent of the constraint imposed?
It doesn't. There are additional dwellings that have come forward, but those are largely renewals of existing consents or replacement dwellings, so there's no net additions to stock. But yes, my analysis remains the same.
Thank you. I want to turn now to the single issue review, as it's called, which is currently being put forward by the council. On the one hand, the council accept that it has limited weight and the outcome of that can't be prejudged now. On the other hand, there have been various references to it in the written and oral evidence by Ms. Greengrass. Can we go to your proof for your evidence, 6.1.24?
Yes.
And just outline for us how you see the current weight to be given to the single issue review.
Yeah, the process of it in the SIR, for short, has been a previous consultation on this so-called single issue review, where the authority's view it would just be growth of 1 that is reviewed. That's a matter, obviously, for the inspector ultimately to determine. But the plan is very much in its infancy, and I think that is demonstrated by the first consultation that was undertaken, the council's approach was to say, suggest that the broad locations may not be needed. So the potential for the single issue review to, in effect, do away with those broad locations. There is a current consultation underway, again, another Reg 18 consultation. The council now has said, following consideration of the representations of the first Reg 18 consultation, it now sees there is a need to retain those broad locations, albeit in the council's view, they don't consider they will still be required in the plan period. But I think it just goes to show the way that the change between those two plans, very little weight, if no weight at all, can be applied to those documents.
And it was said by Miss Greengrass in her proof that in the context of single issue, the council's not shying away from their responsibilities. Do you agree?
No, I don't. I think the process for the previous local plan review, I think probably demonstrates that to an extent, and that there's a lot of time and effort devoted to that local plan review by a lot of people, a lot of organisations, not just developers, but other sectors of the community and organisations. And it got through the examination process. The examination process was still in play, as it were, because the inspector had delivered his view on the modifications necessary to make the plan sound. So it was at a very advanced stage, but clearly the council were of the view, it disagreed with the inspector's views and modifications, and abandoned the plan at that stage. So I think the fact that it's been put that we're not shying away from responsibilities, I think it's not a fair reflection of reality on what happened previously, because I don't think we can have that much confidence that the council in the current plan, the current SIR, simply may do the same. Like the response or the views of the local plan inspector, history may tell us there's a possibility, a distinct possibility, that it could take the same view.
Next subject matter is the broad locations in the local plan. And could you please take up Ms. Greengrass's proof, page 16, paragraph 6.6. Right at the bottom of page 16, what Ms. Greengrass says is that the broad locations have no greater status than any other, as she calls it, speculative site on the edge of a town or settlement. Do you agree that the being within a broad location is of no consequence, no relevance at all in considering either accordance to the plan as a whole or other material considerations if there's non-accordance? Are they of no relevance whatsoever in the way that she describes?
No, I think that's a wrong interpretation.
And why do you say that?
Clearly, they are the broad locations. I would say form a central component of the strategy of the whole plan. They are specifically identified in the plan as key diagrams. They are specifically referred to in the plan under table 3.2, where to deliver the council's housing requirement, 1,800 dwellings need to be provided from those broad locations in the plan period. So to dismiss them as not being relevant, I think it is incorrect.
Thank you. Anything more you want to say on the broad locations? I've got a couple more points and we're done. So page 46 of your proof, consideration of accordance with the plan as a whole. Can you just summarise your position, having heard the evidence as well yesterday, Ms. Greengrass, why it is you say that the proper conclusion is there's accordance with the plan as a whole?
Yes, obviously it's a balancing exercise when you have to look at consistency and inconsistency with the policies. But in paragraph 5.1.32, I look at, and the paragraphs above, I look at the consistency overall, the plan overall, what that's seeking to do. What the plan is seeking to do is seeking to locate growth and focus growth at Soham, being one of the three principal towns in the district. It's a site that's accepted as falling within the key diagram as a broad location for housing growth in the plan, as acknowledged to be required within the plan period. There is an acknowledged very significant shortfall. I've put the third bullet, 2,343. I think that figures up to 2,700. Mr. Austin fell. But it's a very significant shortfall in the plan period. And there is no revised plan in place, which there can be any weight given to rectify that situation. The proposal will deliver a high quality scheme consistent with other policy, HLU 1. The other policies I've gone through there, which are most relevant, also demonstrate the compliance with the plan as a whole. The final bullet point talks about the affordable housing need and what this proposal will do. I've referred to 36% in my proof as the figure. It's obviously 30% plus 10 dwellings, but that's, if I have referred to 36, that's the reason for it. Because it's 63 dwellings based upon 175 dwellings. But overall, I think it demonstrates that the non-compliance with growth 2 and the limited harm to growth 2 demonstrates that, in my view, there is compliance with that plan when it is read as a whole.
Then, penultimate question, can you go to your rebuttal? And there's a table you set out in Appendix 1. And indeed, then the development benefits table in Appendix 2, where you seek to effectively synthesise the council's position, the appellant's position on a sort of ready reckoner table for the inspector. First, I think there was a typo on Appendix 1 you just wanted to correct whilst you had that open.
Just bear with me while I bring that document up, please. Sorry, just hold on there. Okay, where in the rebuttal are we going?
Within it's the table in Appendix 1, first of all, sir. So immediately behind page 9.
Right, thank you.
And yeah, Mr. Hill, do you want to just flag up the typo that you wanted to make?
Yeah, very brief. What the purpose of this table does is to try to set out, based on the evidence of myself and Ms. Greengrass, what our positions are in relation to policy compliance, the updatedness of the policies, and whether they are most important or not. And there's a simple yes and no approach. Yeah. Or if it's blank, it's because there isn't a view provided. Just in relation to growth 2, you'll see I put policy compliant yes, clearly. I haven't said that to no, so that'll be an end. I think Ms.
Sorry, Mr. Hill, your signal's not very good. The sound quality coming through is not very good at this end. So you just broke up a bit there. If you could just repeat, please.
Just bear with me a moment, so I'll put some headphones on. Yeah.
Is it any clearer?
Yes, that is better. Thank you.
Yes, Appendix 1 of my rebuttal. It basically tries to summarise the position of myself and Ms. Greengrass in relation to each of the policies that the statement of common ground addresses being most.
It was just the correction you were seeking to make in relation to growth 2 that I missed.
It is, yeah, that's it. It is, yeah.
And then in the benefits table on appendix 2.
Sorry, I'm sorry. I'm still not clear on what the correction is you were seeking to make to growth 2.
Oh, sorry, if you look at the line growth 2,
yes,
follow it across. If you see that it says the appellant's position,
yes,
you see I've got policy compliant as a Y.
Oh, I see. Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And then in terms of the benefits table, appendix 2, in relation to the design benefits, You heard the evidence of Miss Greengrass yesterday that the scheme, in light of Mr. Reynolds' evidence, could be said to fall within category A of paragraph 134 of the framework. And the framework says that where development does fall within category A or B of that paragraph, significant weight should be given to that. Having heard that evidence, is there anything you'd like to do by way of updating the table in Appendix 2?
Yes, Appendix 2, line 10. In effect, it's the design. I've talked about improvements to the development edge in light of, I've scored it or thought it moderate weight in light of the discussion yesterday. I think it is appropriate to increase that to significant, reflective of the guidance in the framework of para 134.
Thank you. And the last question, in light of all of that and your analysis, the evidence you've heard, what is your judgment as to whether this is a site which is a suitable location for residential development?
Yes, I think so. The question asked by the Inspect the Case Management Conference. Without going to it, I'll summarise it in para 9.1.24 of my proof, where I basically, it is my view, it is a suitable location for residential development having regard to planning policy.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. If you've got nothing further to add, that's the evidence in chief. Stay there and for that to be some cross-examination.
Right, okay, thank you for that. Mr. Smythe, are you ready to proceed with cross-examination?
Yes, sir, thank you. Morning, Mr. Hill.
Morning, Mr. Smythe.
Can we first take up the local plan? Page 23.
Yeah.
And we've got a section entitled Locational Strategy, which I read to be the explanatory text which accompanies Growth 2. So in this local plan, the explanatory text precedes each policy, as I read it. Can we look at the bottom of page 23, paragraph 3.3.4? The local plan tells us that part of this strategy also involves trying to ensure that as much development as possible takes place within the built-up areas, the market towns and villages, rather than in the open countryside. So if I pause there, that is a common thread running through many development plans, isn't it? Trying to protect the countryside and focusing development at the bigger settlements.
Yes, I agree with that, yeah.
And if we carry on reading through it, there's then a couple of qualifications and then over the page. However, the overall aim is to focus development within or on the edge of towns and villages and to minimise unnecessary development of open fields and countryside areas of the district. This strategy is in accordance with the NPPF, which states that local authorities should protect the intrinsic character of the countryside for its own sake. Development envelopes have therefore been drawn around the main built-up areas of the market towns and villages in order to prevent sprawl into the open countryside and protect the character and setting of the settlements. Do you see that?
I do, yes, yeah.
Yeah. And it's common ground that the appeal offends Growth 2. Did you help write the planning statement?
It was a few years ago. I probably would have seen it. I had an oversight of it for sure.
Yeah. Should we take that up? It's called up at 1.49. It's July 2019, so it's 2.5 years ago. You can be forgiven if you can't remember exactly what your role was.
Which section, sorry?
Yeah, so to just start on the second page, just so we know what the role is, it looks like it's prepared by David Owen and your good self. Between the two tram lines, I think. Yeah. I think what you're saying is that Mr. Owen did most of the drafting. You may have overseen it as far as you can remember. Bear in mind, you've probably done dozens and dozens of these sorts of documents before since that time. Is that fair?
That's fair, yes.
Yeah. Can we look at page 20? Where are we? Yeah, page 22. And just so we are clear where we are, page 21, we've got a section at the bottom of page 21 entitled Consistency with the Development Plan. So this is where that issue is being dealt with. And if we look at paragraph 5.51, given the location of the application site, it clearly falls in the area identified under the Soham key diagram and is referred to in the supporting text for Growth 4. The application is consistent with both policies Growth 2 and Growth 4, and is therefore consistent with the development plan.
Can I just read the paragraph?
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
It's paragraph 5.50 you're referring to.
5.1, yeah, 5.51.
Yeah.
So in the planning statement, which provides the planning justification for the planning application and which informed the consultation by members of the public, it's been said by you and Mr. Owen that the appeal complies with Growth 2, but the appeal has proceeded on the basis that it offends Growth 2. So my question for you is why the change of position?
No, I think what we're saying, well, if you go back to, just bear you a moment. (5.5) I talk about a tension between Growth 2 and Growth 4. The fact that it indicates consistent with Growth 2 is incorrect. I think we're saying it's consistent with Growth 4. And I've set that out in my evidence. It's clearly outside of the settlement boundary. I would, without going back through this document, I'm pretty sure I would acknowledge the fact that it is outside the settlement boundary. Clearly, it's wrong to say it's consistent with Growth 2. It falls outside the settlement boundary.
Okay. Well, I'll leave it there. These errors sometimes happen. The inspector has the benefit, doesn't he?
Have we finished, Mr. Smythe, with the planning statement? Going to put that away?
We have, yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
The inspector here is in a fortunate position that he has the benefit of 2 recent decision letters which grapple with some of the very same issues that he has to grapple with.
So is that a question?
It is.
And the question is, does it deal with some of the same issues?
No, the question is, the inspector is in a fortunate position, isn't he? Because he has the benefit of 2 recent inspector's decisions, which grapple with some of the very same issues which he faces.
It does indeed.
Yeah. And these 2 decisions of Inspector Searson and Inspector Chamberlain are material considerations of importance and weight, aren't they?
They are indeed.
Both inspectors conclude that Growth 2 is not out of date, don't they?
They do, and both inspectors reduce the weight due to the conflict of the limited. I'll start again. Both inspectors take a view in relation to the appeal proposals before them that the conflict with those policies is reduced due to the linkages of Growth 2 to Growth 1.
Yeah, well, that's a different point. There's 2 issues. First issue, is Growth 2 out of date or not? It's a binary issue, like a light switch. It's either out of date or it's not. And both inspectors say it's not out of date. The next issue is how much weight you give to Growth 2 and the conflict with it.
Indeed, they do.
Yes.
Yes, and they base that judgment on a balance. They both said on balance, due to, and I took the inspector earlier to them, in particular Inspector Chamberlain's view, due to the comprehensive list of exceptions afforded by Growth 2.
Can we take up, if we take it in time, can we take up Inspector Searson's decision first, which is core document 5.3? Did you attend as a spectator this hearing, Mr. Hill?
I didn't. I believe a colleague did.
Yeah, and did you attend any part of the Chamberlain's hearing?
No, I didn't know.
No, fine, okay. So we can see Inspector Searson, it's a 3-day hearing, and the decision is September 2020, so that's 16 months ago, isn't it?
It is, yes.
Yeah, and if we look at the appearances, we can see that Paul Tucker, Queen's Counsel, on the final page, or penultimate page, represented the appellant. Do you see that?
I do, yes, yeah.
And if we look at the hearing documents, just so, because I know sometimes the point is made that hearings don't provide the level of scrutiny that an inquiry does. Well, we've got silk for the appellant, it's 3 days. And if you look at hearing document 5, Mr. Tucker put in written submissions on housing land supply. Do you see that? And I put submissions in response at document 6.
Yes, I see that, yeah.
Can we turn to paragraph 63? The inspector crystallises the debate which was front and centre at that hearing. The main focus of the debate in respect to whether the most important policies can be regarded as out of date relate to Growth 2, SS1 and Growth 1. The appellant submits that Growth 2 is intrinsically linked to Growth 1 and as such should be afforded reduced weight. So I pause there. That is the same argument as the argument which it forms one of the arguments which you're advancing at this inquiry, isn't it?
It is, yes.
Yeah. And then paragraph 64, Growth 2 and Neighbourhood Plan SS1 set out the location and spatial strategy. Growth 1 sets out their housing requirements. This is to be considered out of date. The review considers that other strategic policies, including Growth 2, is not in need of updating. Do you see that?
I do, yes, yeah.
And then paragraph 65, Growth 2 seeks to strictly control development outside of development envelopes, having regard to the need to protect countryside. It could be argued the framework is more holistic in its approach to rural housing and does not count the need to protect countryside in such stringent terms. That's the point you drew attention to in evidence in chief. That said, the policy offers a number of exceptions, and then on balance, the inspector forms the view that it's up to date. And then if we turn, so there's not a question for that, I'm just drawing, building on that to then bring to the next excerpt. If we turn over to paragraph 70, the Wychford Neighbourhood Plan examiner also noted that whilst Growth 1 may have been challenged as being out of date, the same is not true of the locational strategy set out in Growth 2. On this point, the examiner notes, and I quote, the locational strategy of the local plan focuses development on Ely, Littleport and Soham and larger village centres, which remains the plan objective, even in circumstances where a 5-year housing supply cannot be delivered. Wychford, under the locational strategy, is not required to accommodate more than small-scale development within the development limits. I find no reason to disagree with that stance as a matter which was examined as part of the neighbourhood plan process. Do you see that?
Yeah.
So in this first dispute, which the inspector has to adjudicate upon as to whether Growth 2 is out of date because it's infected by Growth 1, the view, your primary case, I understand there's an issue of weight, we'll come to that, but your primary case that Growth 2 is out of date is contrary to the view of the neighbourhood plan examiner, and it's contrary to the views of the 2 inspectors who've made decisions in the last year and a half.
Well, I've made that case. I've accepted that point in my evidence. they base their judgment as a balance, and I based my judgment of a balance. They based their judgment of a balance based upon the evidence before them. I've based my judgment as a balance based on the evidence I've presented here and I've considered here.
Yeah, no, I understand, but as it's common ground that these two inspectors' decisions are material considerations of importance and weight, you've got three options. You either agree the conclusion of the inspector, option 2 is you disagree, option 3, you say the conclusion is stale because some new piece of evidence or circumstance has arisen, which invalidates effectively what was a correct conclusion at the time, but is no longer holds good. So am I right in saying that on this issue about whether it's out of date, you're in option 2 territory? You just take a different planning judgment to the two inspectors and the examiner?
I take the view that growth 1 is out of date and growth 1 links directly to growth 2. A principal component, a principal part of growth 2 is to deliver the housing requirement of an out-of-date policy. So it's not known, because of that out-of-datedness of growth 1, it's not known whether growth 2 can fulfill and deliver sufficient housing over the planned period, because the housing requirement, there is no up-to-date housing requirement. I've based that as in my professional judgment, and also based upon the evidence that I've looked at further in having regard to the both inspectors looked at the exceptions listed in growth 2. That would seem to be a pivotal part of their considerations as to how flexible growth 2 is to deliver additional housing, and that's formed part of my balanced judgment.
So is the answer to my question yes?
To answer my question, in terms of your narrative, it'd be between 2 and 3, or both 2 and 3, where a point of principle is out of date and also based on the evidence I've considered and looked at.
Right. So where in your written evidence do you draw attention to a change of circumstance, which means that Searson and Chamberlain's view no longer holds good, is stale? I thought you just took a different planning judgment. We're in territory of option 2. If you're saying option 3, what's changed?
There's 2. Disappeared.
Sorry, Mr. Hills, that's very rude of me, so I'll just check something. Thanks.
There's 2 issues there. One is, yes, I take a different view as a point of principle, and also I draw, which I highlighted in my opening, I provide evidence in my appendix 3, an analysis and assessment of the exceptions listed in growth 2 as to how effective they have been, and I don't believe that the exceptions provide a flexible supply, enable a flexible supply of additional housing to come forward. The strict and tight controls retained by growth, by the settlement boundaries, which underpin growth 2, means that there's very limited supply of additional housing coming forward, and that's based on the additional analysis and evidence presented here that I don't believe was evidence before the 2 previous inspectors you refer to.
Understood. Thank you. Can we next take up Mr. Chamberlain's decision, which I think is 5.54, I think.
I'm not sure that the core documents go up that far on the.
Oh, right. 5.43, sorry.
Thank you.
And if we look at page 11, paragraph 54, so the inspector writes that policy growth 1 is out of date because the housing requirement it specifies is out of date. This may have infected the entire spatial strategy, including policy 2, because settlement boundaries may be too tightly drawn, housing may be directed to too few settlements, and there may not be enough allocations. Do you see that?
I do, yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, isn't a fair reading of Inspector Chamberlain's decision effectively what he's saying is it's too soon to conclude that growth 2 is out of date. It's premature to say growth 2 is out of date because we don't know the extent to which the housing requirement of growth 1 will be uprated. If there's only a modest uprating, growth 2 can stay as is. What's your response to that?
Sorry, what's the question?
Yes, I'm asking you to, whether you agree or not with the statement that a fair reading of this paragraph is that the inspector is reaching a view that it's too soon to conclude that growth 2 is out of date.
Well, he doesn't.
And it's premature.
I don't think he uses. This is paragraph 54. Is he referring to?
Yeah. If you're about to say he doesn't say that, I agree. It's not explicit. I'm inviting you to agree the implication of his words. The repeated use of the word may indicates the inspector thought it was too soon to conclude that growth 2 is out of date. And it's premature to make that judgment. We don't know what's happening with growth 1.
Yes, I think he's basically saying that in his view, based on the evidence he'd seen, that growth 2 remained up to date as he set out in 54 and 55.
Next topic is looking at the development plan as a whole.
Can I put that away?
You can, Mr. Hill, yes. Yeah. I want to kind of deal with an issue of principle here. So don't be too concerned about East Cambridge's development plan, but more generally, locational strategy is one of the main things a development plan does, isn't it?
One of them, yes.
Yes. Well, can you think of a more important objective of any development plan other than locational strategy?
Can I just grab the local plan? I know we're talking principles here. Can I just grab the local plan itself?
Yeah, it's core document 3.1, I think.
Yep.
I suspect you're looking at page 16. You're trying to look for other strategic objectives.
I am, and I'm looking at the objectives section. Yeah, indeed. Correct. I'm with you now. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm with you. Yeah.
Well, I think my question still stands.
Sorry, Mr. Spylight.
Yeah, I've asked you to agree that locational strategy is one of the main things any development plan does. You sought to downplay that a bit and said it's one of the things it does. I then said to you, well, can you think of any other objective more important than locational strategy?
Well, I was actually agreeing with your opening when I think you said it was one of the most important in your opening. And I think if the inspector goes to section 2.5, the objectives, it sets out a whole series of objectives. The development strategy is clearly one of the most fundamental parts of that plan, but those objectives are critical to deliver the vision for the plan, and they range to a whole variety of issues, from locating growth to reduce car use, to dealing with flood risk and surface water, to dealing with diversity of the natural and built environment. So there's a whole range of issues. I don't think we can play one off against the other. As a collective, they are all most important.
Locational strategy goes to the very heart of the local plan, doesn't it?
It's one of the, yes, the principles that underpin the plan, I would agree.
And you seem to be uncomfortable with the expression "go to the heart of." Is that? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but use your own words.
It's just not a term that I've seen referred to in the framework or anything of that nature. It's not a planning terminology, put it that way.
Yeah, and in this local plan, the locational strategy is contained within Growth 2, isn't it?
It sets out the locational strategy. It does, yes.
Yeah. And we can agree, can't we, that Growth 2, far from being an incidental policy, is a very important policy of the local plan.
I agree, yes. Yeah.
As I said in opening, if you count it all up, the local plan has 47 main policies, and then it's got the separate housing allocations and employment allocations. Yes?
It does, yeah.
Yeah. The point you make in your proof that the fact that there's a breach of a policy doesn't mean it offends the development plan, and that policies can pull in different directions. Which policy or policies do you say of the local plan pull in a different direction to Growth 2?
I said I've hopefully made it clear throughout. It's the plan. You have to read the plan as a whole. I don't think it has to be a specific plan, a policy. It doesn't have to be a specific section of the plan. It doesn't have to be a specific reason justification paragraph. I think you have to read the plan as a whole, and there can be areas of that plan that will pull in different directions. And I think it's common that it's fairly rare to find a large application where it would be consistent with all policies of the plan, which is why it is important to look at the plan as a whole, what the plan as a whole is seeking to do and deliver.
I'm asking you whether you can identify any particular policy or element of policy which you say pulls in a different direction to Growth 2. It seems to me that Growth 2 is the only policy which sets out locational strategy. And you may have a drainage policy or a heritage policy, but that doesn't pull in a different direction to Growth 2. But correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, you are correct in terms of specific policy, but as I just made the point, you have to read the plan as a whole and what the plan as a whole is seeking to do. And the plan of the whole is looking to deliver the objectives of the plan, the vision of the plan. And if you go back to the objectives of the plan, there's some fairly fundamental areas of those objectives, such as meeting housing needs, providing a range of new housing at appropriate locations, supporting and enhancing the vitality of towns, ensuring new development of high quality. So I think that's the critical element of the plan.
Next, can we look at Growth 4? I'll give you a reference. So that's on the bottom page 36.
Yep.
And just so we know where we are, the broad locations which you place store by, well, both parties place store by, question of how much weight you give to it, is page 32 within the explanatory text.
The key diagram, yeah.
Yes, that's right, yeah. And then the policy itself is in the box at bottom page 36. Land to be allocated in the local plan to enable the delivery of 6,500 dwellings on the edge of towns and villages. 139 hectares of employment land, and then the sites which make up that are then listed in that table beneath it. Do you see that?
I do, yeah.
So the 6,500 dwellings referenced at the start of Growth 2 are those found in the chart. They aren't those found in the key diagram which I referred to earlier.
Correct.
Yeah. So the broad locations aren't referenced in Growth 4 policy at all, are they?
They're not in the policy. I've acknowledged that. That's correct.
Can we look at the explanatory text, paragraph 3.5.6, which is on page 31?
Yeah.
And it's sort of, just so we know where we are. Yes, at the bottom of the page. It identifies there'll be sufficient overall supply of land to meet the district's housing requirement of 11,500 dwellings, as set out in policy Growth 1. The latest projections as of September 2014 indicate that an estimated 12,000 additional dwellings could come forward between 2011 and 2031. It's estimated that approximately 6,500 of these dwellings will be on new allocations, mainly on the edges of existing towns and villages. So I pause there, that's where we were in the box earlier. And then it goes on to say, the table also includes reference to broad allocations, which are identified in the key diagrams below. The diagrams are indicative only and identify broad areas on the edge of Soham and Littleport, which are identified as phase 2 sites in the Soham and Littleport master plans and could be developed in the future. Supply from this sort is not anticipated to be required in strategic terms until the latter part of the plan period. Therefore, the locations are broadly identified at this stage, and it's intended that the site-specific boundaries will be identified through the local plan review. Do you see that?
I do, yeah.
And so we can agree, can't we, that the reference to broad locations is tentative rather than firm?
How can you qualify that question, please? How do you mean? What do you mean by that?
I'm drawing reference to the particular words used in the policy. It says indicative only, could be developed, not anticipated until the end of the plan period, broadly identified, intended for the site-specific boundary to identified through the local plan review.
Yes, but it was your use of the word tentative. I didn't quite. And how do you mean? What do you mean by tentative? Do you mean something might or might not happen? Is that what you're?
Yes, tentative rather than firm.
I'd actually disagree with that. What Growth 2 is about, it's about delivery in relation to housing, of the housing requirements of the plan of Growth 1. You have to read the whole of the policy and the RJ together. Critically important to this is table 3.2, where you will see on the bottom line, the top of page 34, it has 1,800 dwellings to come forward within the planned period from broad locations. So it's not a tentative element of the policy. There's nothing tentative about the broad locations. They are within the plan, identified in key diagrams within the plan as being required to fulfill, critically to fulfill the strategy of that plan. There's nothing about them that says they won't come forward. Indeed, the officer's advice on the Littleport application says it's always been envisaged they will come forward in the plan period. The local plan inspector was very, very clear that the purpose of the local plan review wasn't to debate whether they are required, or wasn't to debate them in detail, it was to bring them forward. The broad locations are a fundamental part of that plan. And in relation to the policy itself, to Growth 4, you will see Growth 4. It's a very lengthy policy, and as I acknowledge, it doesn't mention broad locations at all. What it does do, though, it identifies the allocations at Soham on the bottom of page 37. And in there, you'll see there's 8 allocations. And those 8 allocations go back to table 3.2. And you'll see, if you're following with me, you'll see under table 3.2, it's got a line against Soham. And you'll see there the figure of 1620 dwellings. So the 1620 dwellings are the culmination. I think there's actually a discrepancy of 20 dwellings, but there's a culmination of the allocations SOH1 to SOH8. I've referred these in my appendix 3. If you just allow me to go to that, and I've identified these for the inspector's attention. Are you able to take up appendix 2 to my proof? What appendix 2 does, it shows the progress of, I've done the same with Littleport and Ely, but it's specifically in relation to Soham. It shows the progress of the delivery of these growth 4 allocations. And what it demonstrates, and this was looked at under the housing land supply session, what it demonstrates is that the bulk of those sites have simply not come forward. We have got, what, 9 and a bit years left of the plan, 9 years, 2 months left of the plan. And the bulk of these sites have simply not come forward. And the way the plan, my plan appendix 2 of Soham works is that the, if you like, the hatched areas, with the exception of the Peel site, are those locations where there was no application in red on them. The darker red, if you like, is where there is a current application. If you take just one example, SOH3, that's identified under growth 4 for 600 dwellings as the Eastern Gateway site. Now, Mr. Ostenfeld referred to that in his trajectory work, where the original view was this site would start delivering in 2016. The council's view is that it will now start delivering 2026. So the relevance of broad locations to all this is that the sites are simply not delivering. They simply won't deliver the requirements of table 3.2 that underpins the whole strategy of the plan for Soham. Therefore, there is a clear relevance of the broad locations to assist with fulfilling that vision, to deliver those housing requirements. We know 1620 is not going to be delivered. Mr. Ostenfeld's, I think, uncontested evidence was that there will be a 500 dwelling shortfall at Soham. Going back to growth 4 and the RJ, they are critical components, particularly in relation to Soham, to fulfill the strategy of the plan. Thank you.
Page 256, please.
256 of the plan?
Yes.
Yeah.
So we've got a section titled the strategic objectives for Soham, and then under housing, the second paragraph, a development envelope has been drawn around Soham to define the built-up part of the town where housing development may be permitted. The purpose is to prevent sprawl into the open countryside. Outside the development envelope, housing will not normally be permitted unless there are exceptional circumstances, such as essential dwellings for rural workers or affordable housing. Housing schemes outside the development envelope will be assessed against policy growth 2 and other local plan policies as appropriate. Do you see that?
I do, yeah.
And then if we go over the page, the local plan tells us the town has further capacity to expand to the north and south, but it's considered vital that the identified local plan housing allocations come forward first to support the vision for the town. Potential phase 2 housing areas to the north and south are shown indicatively in the Soham master plan vision. these areas are referenced in Policy Growth 4 as broad locations where housing could come forward in the latter part of the plan period, and are shown indicatively in the diagram in Chapter 3. It should be noted that these are not precise or accurate allocations, and further investigative work on site, deliverability and suitability will be required in the future prior to allocation in the development plan. Do you see that?
I do, yeah.
So on this issue about it in the latter part of the plan period, there are 9 years still left of the plan period, aren't there?
Indeed, yes.
And there is reference to the requirement for further investigative work on suitability, isn't there?
That's what that section says, yes.
Yeah. Well, I'm suggesting to you that the requirement for further investigative work on suitability and the fact that it's very clear there should be a sequence and phase 1 should come forward first and then phase 2 towards the end of the plan period diminishes the weight that the inspector ought to give to broad locations.
Well, I think you have to look at where we are on the ground now. I think it's quite clear, as I've just taken yourself, Inspector, through my Appendix 2 at Soham, it's quite clear that the other sites at Soham are coming forward, but they are simply not going to deliver the strategy of the plan for Soham. So in relation to the further investigative work, there's been a substantial amount of investigative work in relation to this particular site. Firstly, through the Soham Master Plan, which actually identifies this area as the Northern Gateway in the Soham Master Plan. There's been a substantial amount of investigative work undertaken as part of the withdrawn local plan that allocated the site. And there's clearly been a substantial amount of investigative work undertaken through this planning application, which hasn't revealed, and it's common ground, any site-specific issues that would, if you like, withhold delivery from the site.
Next topic is the most important policies. So we've got a reservoir of relevant policies, and what the framework requires us to do is to use our planning judgment to draw out, to fish out of the pool of relevant policies, which one's the most important. Do we agree on that?
It does, yeah.
Yeah. And what filter or what approach have you taken to distinguish between relevant policies and those which you judge to be most important?
Well, first of all, as Miss Greengrass said yesterday, I've taken a planning judgment, my judgment. That's fundamentally, though, based on the proposals before us, the application proposal. Yeah,
because the most important policies depend on the particular proposal in question, doesn't it?
It does, indeed.
Yeah, so for the sake of argument, you could have a site where the most important policies are A, B, C, D, and a different proposal, perhaps in a different village, the most important policies may be B, C, D, E.
Correct, yes.
Yeah. And when deciding which policies can aptly be described as the most important, the question for the inspector is, which policies help him decide the appeal?
I don't think that's the way the framework, it's the application. I don't think you look at the refusal policy. You have to look at those policies that are relevant to the determination of the application. So
yeah,
it's a broader basket of policies, isn't it?
Yeah, perhaps my use of the word appeal was misleading.
Okay.
Point made to you is that the whole purpose of most important policies is they're the policies the inspector can hold up and judge the acceptability of this proposal.
I agree, yes, yeah.
Yeah. And you include Growth 1 and Growth 4, don't you, as most important policies?
I do, yes, yeah.
Yeah. Can we take up Mr. Chamberlain's decision, which is core document 3.43? I don't think it is. Where are we? 5.43 in the note, sorry. And then it's page 10. Let me know when you're there.
In there, yep.
Yeah, so it's towards the bottom of page 10 at paragraph 51, so about halfway down. Policy 4 is relevant to my considerations as part of the spatial strategy in the local plan, but it is not a most important policy because it does not set out a housing requirement, a locational strategy for growth, or provide specific guidance on how to consider development proposals at Widgford. So if you delete the word Widgford and insert the word Soham, we can agree, can't we, that Inspector Chamberlain takes a different view to you and says that Grove 4 ought not to be an MIP.
I don't think you can do it. I think it'd be wrong to do that. I've addressed this in my proof. Widgford is dealt with very, very differently in the plan to Soham. Soham is a market town. Witchingford is one of the villages. Soham is a location where growth is to be focused under growth 2. I think the important element that I've just been through is that growth 4 lists allocations at Soham. There is 8 allocated housing sites at Soham that are relevant to the consideration. So they do contain, that policy is relevant because it does contain allocated sites at Soham, and those allocated sites are relevant to this appeal because they are simply not delivering housing that the vision and the strategy of the plan originally envisaged.
Yeah, forgive me if I've not been clear. No one disputes it's not relevant. The question is whether you pluck Growth 4 and say it's a most important policy.
Well, that's the reason.
I'm struggling to understand your case because in your own evidence, if you take up page 39, you've got a page 39 of your main proof. You've got a helpful chart summarising your approach to policy. And if you look at Growth 4, page 39, whether it's policy compliant or not, you say neutral. So if the appeal is neutral on Growth 4, how can it be said as a matter of logic that Growth 4 is a most important policy to help the inspector determine the appeal?
Yeah, I've put neutral because Growth 4 doesn't list the site, doesn't list this appeal site. But I've been through the RJ and the relevance of the RJ. But the relevance of Growth 4, why it's most important, is because it has allocations at Soham, where this site is located, that are essential to deliver the vision of the plan. That vision is simply not being delivered by those allocations. This is an application and appeal at Soham that can assist with the delivery of that vision. It's identified as a broad location, so it's got to be irrelevant. It's got to be a most important policy because it's directly relevant to this application.
Okay, so just so I understand your evidence, you're saying that the conclusion that Inspector Chamberlain made that Growth 4 was out of date, you say is specific to the circumstance of Witchford, and a different view should be reached for Soham.
Yeah, I think if you look at that sentence you just read, the final part of it, he said it's a relevant policy, but not a most important policy. It doesn't set out housing requirements, a locational strategy for growth, or provide specific guidance on how to consider development proposals at Witchford. I think Growth 4 does that for Soham. It does set out the development proposals for Soham that relate to Soham. It's got a housing requirement in the plan, and the allocations at Soham are fundamentally important to deliver that requirement. And it's not delivering that requirement, it's not delivering the vision of the plan.
Understood. Can you just give me a moment? So I just want to check something. So timing wise, so I've probably got another 15 minutes or so. So I'm happy to carry on, but I just want to check something in my notes for.
Yes, sorry, I'm muted. Would this be a good time to take a short break then, if you want to check? So we're coming up to an hour and a half anyway.
Yeah, well, that's what I was kind of getting at. Yeah, I'm happy to plough on. Whatever's, and if Mr. Hill wants a break, then.
Yeah,
If you've got 15 minutes, happy to plough on.
Let's take 20 minutes, please, and we'll come back and continue after that. So we'll adjourn now until 11:15. Oh,
just to flag up,
so
I've circulated a K in light of how the points were put in relation to plan as a whole. There's a court judgment which I think will assist you. So I've asked that to be circulated, and I may come back to that in re-examination.
Right. Okay. And yeah, that's fine. You've circulated it already.
I've sent it. I haven't sent it to Mr. Hill yet because obviously he's. I can't contact him. I might have to send it to him when I ask him. But I sent it to you and Mr. Smythe. And it's paragraph 66 to 68 of Mr. Justice Holgate's judgment are worth looking at. And maybe Mr. Smythe might want to give me a call because I wouldn't want him to take a bad point.
Okay. I'm assuming that you're hearing this, Mr. Smythe. You're busy looking at something else. Yes. Okay. We have a look at that over the adjournment. All right. We'll adjourn now until 11:15. Thank you.
Jack, I'm told that the host has stopped me being able to share my video, which
Oh no.
here we are. The joke there about a face for radio, probably, but that's better. Thank you.
Right, okay, welcome back everyone. Let's resume, please. Glad to see you've been allowed back in, Mr. Banner. When you're ready, please. Mr.
So
Smart.
thank you. Yeah, not at all. And so thank you for the time. I think that's probably quite useful. I think I may be more like 5 to 10 minutes. We'll see. Can we take up page 40 of your proof, Mr. Hill?
Have we finished with Chamberlain, Mr. Smythe?
I have, yes.
Yeah.
And it's page 40. And it's your paragraph 4.1.165, where you give your overall conclusion that of the 16 policies which are relevant, you say that 12 are MIPs, most important policies, of which 8 are out of date, and of which those 6 are most important. Do you see that?
Yeah.
Haven't you missed out the preceding paragraph? So 4.1.164, you say that policy 16 of the waste plan is up to date and most important. So if that's right, shouldn't it be 13 policies are most important, of which 7?
If that, I'll happily accept that if that's the case. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think it makes any difference, but just arithmetically. So just so the inspectors note, it will be 13 rather than 12. Paragraph 4.1.165, that at the very end, it's 7 rather than 6 are most important. Are you happy with that?
Sorry, no, I think I am right in what I said. I said which are agreed, I think, because that
Okay.
Table then, you see the footnote, it refers to what was agreed through the statement of common ground. So it was those policies in the statement of common ground that were agreed at that time. Since then, I think both Miss Greengrass and myself over the view that 16 is relevant. Policy 16 is most important.
Yeah, okay, fine. Just 2 final topics to deal with then. The withdrawn plan, you deal with at page 25 of your proof. And it's paragraph 4.1.86. And you tell us
which paragraph?
4.1.86.
Okay.
And you tell us towards the end, as I address later on my evidence with reference to the appeal site, this is exactly what happened through the local plan review until the very late stages where the council didn't agree with the inspector's report and withdrew that local plan. Do you see that?
Yeah, I think by inspector's report, I agree. It wasn't inspector's report. It was the main modifications that the inspector's letter. It was the main modifications that the inspector provided to the local authority at the time. Wasn't the report that had yet to come?
Yes. So as I understand it, what had happened is the inspector had produced correspondence suggesting potential main modifications which would need another round of consultation. And it's at that point the council pulled the plug.
That's correct. Yes, a very advanced stage in the process.
Right, but there were still outstanding objections, weren't there, to the site?
Well, those, had the council gone with the main modifications, that would have been subject to further consultation on the main mods. So there's still a further round to go. It's unusual that I've done countless examinations, it's usual that there are further oral sessions into main modifications. It does happen, but there's a further round to go. So it clearly wasn't the final stage, but it was the inspector's view at that time what modifications were necessary in order to make the plan sound.
But
it's included. Sorry.
Yeah, but it's inaccurate for you to say until the very final stages, because that rather gives the impression to the inspector we were on the cusp of.
Sorry, I couldn't disagree more. I couldn't disagree more. There, it is at the very final stages when you think the length and time of local plans take from their infancy to adoption. that is at the very, very final stages. Plans take, and this plan probably took 4 or 5 years. We're probably a matter of a few months away from the plan being concluded. So I would stick fairly firmly to that view.
Yeah, so I think maybe it depends whether, when you say very final stages, you mean very final stages of the inspector's scrutiny of the draft plan, whether you take the whole period from glint in the postman's eye, so to speak, of the plan all the way through to adoption.
Well, that's what I was referring to.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, I understand the point. Yeah, fine. Final topic. I want you to assume that the inspector forms a view that the appeal contravenes the development plan as a whole. So obviously, everyone knows that's not a proposition you think is at all persuasive, but for this section, I want you to assume it. Can we take up Inspector Searson's decision?
Have you got the core doc reference?
Yes, 5.3. And it's internal, page 14.
Yeah. Page 14, did you say?
Yeah, page 14, right at the end.
Yeah.
And it's paragraph 90. The development plan is the starting point for decision making. And here, this comprises the local plan, the recently made neighbourhood plan. The framework is clear that where a planning application or appeal conflicts with an up-to-date development plan, permission should not usually be granted. Do you see that?
I do, yes. Yeah.
Can we take up the framework where the inspector derives that point? And it's internal, page 7 of the framework.
Yep.
So the government tells us that the presumption in favour of sustainable development does not change the statutory status of the development plan as a starting point for decision making. Where a planning application can, now pause there, when I say planning application, we can also read that as planning appeal, can't we?
Yeah.
Yeah, so for the sake of argument, let me use that word. Where a planning appeal conflicts with an up-to-date development plan, including any neighbourhood plans that form part of the DP, permission should not usually be granted.
Correct.
So procedure on that basis that the inspector finds that the tilted balance doesn't apply and the proposal conflicts with the development plan as a whole, it's not the end of the story, but the onus then is on you, isn't it, to satisfy the inspector that the particular benefits taken together are sufficiently potent to justify a departure from the starting point. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, you'd have to look at the nature of the conflict with that development plan as a whole, whether it was a conflict that in effect was a technical conflict, which I would say we're not far off here in relation to we are the wrong side of a settlement boundary, but there is very limited harm caused by that conflict. I'd say that's the starting point, and you then have to look at what additional benefits, public benefits that the scheme derives.
I think you're guilty of trying to alter the premise. The premise is, and I know you don't accept the premise is the appeal offends the development plan as a whole. So I don't think it's fair to say it's just a technical breach, because I'm proceeding on the basis if the inspector finds it conflicts the development plan as a whole. Do you understand?
Yes, I do understand that, yeah. But that conflict would be due to growth too in this instance, wouldn't it?
Yes.
That would be the basis of the conflict of the development plan conflict as a whole. So you'd have to say, well, what's the harm then to that conflict? And that harm is reduced by virtue of the nature of the scheme. And the containment that this site is afforded by it's the built environment around it.
Right. Okay. And the government's been very deliberate in how it's drafted paragraph 12, says that planning permission should not usually be granted, doesn't it?
It does, yeah, yeah.
And that imbues a sense that where there's a breach of the development plan as a whole, that granting planning permission should not be done lightly. Do you agree?
Does it use the word likely? I'd agree with the words that are in paragraph 12.
Okay. So you did use the word imbue. The adverb likely isn't used, but the government has deliberately used. It could have just placed a full stop, but it added that bit saying not usually being granted. And I'm suggesting to you that the implication is the government expects that occurrences where planning permission has been granted overriding a breach of the development plan as a whole will be relatively rare, and it wouldn't be something to be done lightly. That's the point I'm putting to you.
Well, I think paragraph 12, and you have to read that in its totality, it envisages there will be instances where the benefits of the scheme outweigh that harm, and that is a fundamental part of 38.6. You don't stop at primacy of the development plan, that's it. It's a fundamental part of 38.6 that material considerations enable developments to come forward where that benefits outweigh the harm. Yeah, I don't think you can divorce one from the other.
Yeah, no, of course. Inspectors every week of the year grant planning permission contrary development plans. I'm not saying you can't. The point putting to you is that the government need not have included those few words. They could have just put a full stop. The government has deliberately included the words should not usually be granted. And I'm suggesting to you that suggests, but no higher than that, it suggests that it would be a relatively rare and it shouldn't be done lightly. I think you're disagreeing with me, but just to...
Well, I think I probably am, yes. I think I probably am.
Fine, okay. Can we next take up paragraph 15? It tells us at the beginning of that paragraph, the planning system should be genuinely plan-led. Do you see that?
I do, yeah.
And again, going back to the point about how government is very careful in the words it uses in the framework, the adverb genuinely imports a sense that the planning system should not simply purport or appear to be plan-led, but it should be plan-led in reality. Do you agree?
Yes, I do. And obviously, we're in the section of the framework that deals with plan making, not decision making. And it's important to read that the whole of that paragraph, isn't it? Which talks about succinct and up-to-date plans. Up-to-date plans should provide a framework for addressing housing needs, and that's clearly where this plan is falling down.
Mr. Hill, I'm afraid you're guilty again of trying to displace the premise. This part of the cross-examination is premised on the fact no tilted balance and it's contrary to development plan as a whole. So I don't think you can rely upon the second bit of paragraph 13 for the purpose of responding to my question.
Well, I'm not entirely sure what the question is, but I say this part of the framework is talking about plan making. It's not talking about decision making. So I'm not entirely clear what the linkage is of the question you're seeking a response to.
Yeah, you agreed that the expression genuinely imports a sense that the planning system should not simply purport or appear to be plan-led. It should be plan-led in reality.
Yes, I agree with that. Yeah.
Yes, and you went on to say the council doesn't have an up-to-date plan for the reasons you've given. I've just pulled you up on the fact this part of the cross-examination is based on a particular premise.
Okay. Yep. I follow that.
Paragraph 9 is on page 5.
Yeah.
And the latter part of paragraph 9, planning policies and decisions should play an active role in guiding development towards sustainable solutions, but in so doing should take local circumstances into account to reflect the character, needs and opportunities of each area. Do you see that?
I do, yes, yeah.
And in this particular area, the district council have adopted a local plan which seeks to strictly control development in the open countryside, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
And so in so doing, the council is taking account of local circumstances.
This is on your premise that growth 2 is up to date, isn't it? Because my premise is that growth 2 isn't up to date. On the whole basis of my view is that growth 2 isn't up to date, is that it isn't complying with paragraph 9 because that control is too strict and it isn't sufficiently flexible. But I accept what you're saying on the premise that you're saying growth 2, if the inspector took the view that growth 2 remained up to date.
Thank you, sir. So I think that's the end of my cross-examination. Will you just give me a moment to check with my team?
While that's being done, sir, just to let you know, I have emailed Mr. Hill that judgment, copy Mr. Smythe in, so he can see that there's no comment in my email, just saying, here's the document, so that Mr. Hill can.
Okay, thank you.
So that's all the questions. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Hill.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Just one matter from me, I think, which probably isn't a surprise to you. It's a question that I asked Ms. Greengrass about affordable housing and the enhanced offer that the appellant is making. I had a response from the appellant in relation to the question that I asked in writing, but it didn't actually tackle the question that I asked in relation to the SIL regulation. So can I ask you now, please, Mr. Hill, whether you think I could attach weight in favour of anything that goes beyond the policy requirement?
Yes, sir. Can you just bear with me while I just pull up the policy? Yes, I think the crux of the matter is, if you look at HOU 3, we're in the second bullet there.
Right, let me just find the policy. What page of the local plan are you on?
46.
Right, okay, so and where are you taking it?
Yeah, it's the second bullet point. And I think the critical issue here is that the policy says a minimum of 30%. So it's not, it would be an incorrect reading of, well, in my view, of the policy to say anything above 30% is not policy compliant. Clearly, the policy allows for provision from 30% to 100%. Our proposal is I'll call it 36%, but you know what I mean in that. Our proposal is 36%, so it is fully compliant with the policy. So the issue then is to say, well, how much weight do you give to? So it is necessary, will be my view, because the policy says it's a minimum, it's a starting point. And in fact, I think so. If you see the council SIL compliance statement, which came out last night, they also now agree the 30% plus the 10 first homes is also SIL compliant.
We'll come on to talk about that because Ms. Greengrass said something different, but we'll deal with that in the section 106 session. But if you just carry on with your position. Yeah,
so 30% is a minimum. So the issue then is how much weight you give to, in effect, the difference between 30 and 36. And the evidence of Mr. Stacey was that substantial weight should be afforded to 30% for all the reasons he set out and the gravity of the shortfall in affordable housing. So then, in my view, it'd be wrong to say you then shouldn't give an enhanced weight to the additional 10 units of affordable housing. That's housing for what, 24, 25 people who are in need of housing now. And there's various inspectors, so I can take you to them if you'd like me to, but there's various inspectors who have considered a comparable level of affordable housing on smaller schemes where they have afforded significant weight to, I think it was 16 dwellings as one of them, 16 affordable housing dwellings. So if you can see what I'm saying, so the weight must be uplifted above, or in my view should be uplifted, because it's quite material, the difference between the 30 to the 36%.
Okay, I'm not asking you whether it complies with policy HOU3 or whether it's a good thing to provide more affordable housing. I'm asking if you hadn't provided the enhanced offer and had just provided 30%, that would have been policy compliant. So is it necessary to provide 36%? Should I refuse the permission if you didn't provide 36%?
You should approve, so in my view, both of them, because they are both necessary, given the scale of the need. My clients and the landowners have taken a commercial view, given the benefit that can be derived from that, or the uplifted benefit, that they will take a view to enhance the offer. And it's necessary for both to come forward, would be my view, and still compliant for both. But actually, so our proposal is the enhanced offer, it's not the lower offer.
What do you say to people that might see that as seeking to buy a planning permission by offering more than the policy requirement to elicit additional favour for the scheme?
I would say that'd be wrong, sir, because the policy specifically says a minimum of 30%. Had it said 30%, there would be a discussion to be had, but I'd say that's a wrong interpretation of the policy. The policy is very specific. That's the starting point, and it's there to be exceeded.
Right, okay, thank you. Just bear with me a moment. Right, okay, thank you. Mr. Banner, any re-examination then, please?
Yes, four subject matters. Firstly, Mr. Hill, towards the beginning of your examination, you were asked various questions about Inspector Searson's findings in the Witchford decision, core document 5.3. I don't think we need to go there actually, in relation to whether Growth 2 was up to date or out of date. And there was a line of questioning where so we can't point to anything new, any change of circumstances since that decision. Well, my question to you, Mr. Hill, is this: if the inspector agrees with you that, with great respect, Inspector Searson got it wrong, that actually on analysis Growth 2 is out of date, does he need to identify a change of circumstances in order to come to a different view? Is that the relevant test?
No, he wouldn't need to.
Second subject matter relates to the question on plan as a whole. Do you call as a line of questioning similar to points actually made, I think, in interjections yesterday, about can you identify any policies that positively pull in the other direction of Growth 2? Could you take up that judgment that was circulated? And when you have it, if you've got it in the Word format, go to page 22. Let me know when you've got page 22. It's paragraph 66.
Yep, I'm with you.
There's a quote from previous case, or including the Milne judgment that Miss Greengrass and I discussed. And then it said at 66 that the claimant's QC in that case submitted that because the council had found conflict with specific development plan policies related to landscape, it was legally impossible to conclude that there were concordance with the plan as a whole unless there was positive support on the other side in relation to other policies. So the kind of countervailing policies that positively pulled in the direction, which outweighed the negative effect of the conflict those policies. And he then went on to say that all the council could do was they point to compliance, if you like, no conflict, as opposed to positive support in relation to the other policies. And it was said that it wasn't possible to say there was accordance to the plan as a whole as a result. And then Mr. Justice Holgate in the second paragraph noted the lack of support. He describes it as a novel gloss on the language, the final sentence of 67. And then what Mr. Justice Holgate says by way of conclusion is at 68, he says, I'm unable to accept the claimant's approach, too mathematical or mechanistic. Conflict with one particular policy may be treated as having an adverse impact and yet of relatively little weight. At the same time, the decision maker may consider that compliance with other policies designed to secure development in general takes place without causing significant harm to a range of environmental factors does involve a greater degree of compliance with the plan than the non-compliance. He then goes on to cite the Rochdale case and passage that I discussed with Miss Greengrass, that you have to have regard to the importance of the policies and the extent of compliance. And he says this idea that you have to find policies that positively pull in the other direction to the conflict is inconsistent with that principle for the reasons he gives there. And he goes on at 69 to say that the above analysis is even clearer in relation to development plans examined under the 2004 Act because of the fact that they have to achieve sustainable development. In the last 5 lines, he says the claimant's insistence that compliance with policies in the post-2004 Act plan designed to promote sustainability by avoiding environmental harm can only be treated as a matter of law as being merely neutral as opposed to positively supportive. He said that approach has no legal foundation and is unprincipled. So in light of that, Mr. Hill, can I just ask you, how does your approach to plan as a whole conflict with growth 2, but not conflict with its purposes, and accordance with all the other policies with some support in them? Is that consistent with the approach of Mr. Justice Holgate?
It is, yes.
Thank you. Then you put that judgment away, and the next point, it was suggested to you that growth 4, on most important policies, suggested to you that growth 4 was only neutral, and if as it was neutral, it wasn't a most important policy, it was just relevant. And I just want to test that point, please. And could we go, please, to Miss Greengrass's proof, page 8. Paragraph 5.4, she lists what she thinks are the most important policies. And of those policies, on the council's case, which of those policies are neutral? How many of them are not neutral in her list?
None of them.
Well, just have another look. What about the page 8, growth 2? Is that neutral?
Oh, sorry, but no, it's not neutral.
Are any other ones not? Are the other ones neutral or not neutral? The other ones she lists.
No, they're not. No.
So if the test put to you is the correct approach to determine the basket of most important policies, you have to look to which policies are neutral. How many most important policies on that approach, the council's approach, how many in truth most important policies are there?
On Miss Greengrass's
on
list.
the approach put to you on her list, if the approach is to look to policies that aren't neutral as opposed to neutral, on the council's approach, how many most important policies would there be?
None of those are neutral.
So would there be any other most important policies beyond Growth 2 on their approach?
No.
And if Growth 2 is out of date, what would that mean for whether the basket of most important policies are up to date or out of date?
The basket of most important policies would be out of date.
Then next point, you were asked some questions about the approach to other material considerations, and those questions started with going back to Inspector Searson's decision, and you were taken to one part of her other material consideration section, but not the rest of it. So can we just look at it in context? It's CD 5.3, and it's page 14. And you were taken to the paragraph 90.
5.3 was it?
5.3, that's right.
Yep.
And you're taken to paragraph 90, where the inspector simply refers to the statutory test and the framework reference to it. You weren't taken to 91, so let's just look at 91, if we may. The landscape harm and the associated policy conflict with the neighbourhood plan, local plan, are determinative in this case and outweigh the planning benefits. So that was the approach that she took in the flat balance. And the landscape harm in question, if we turn a bit further back, pages 4 and 5, excuse me, there's a whole section on landscape and visual effects.
Yeah.
Finding of harm, significant in planning terms, and conflict with a range of policies as a result. So how comparable in your judgment is the situation in that case and the flat balance, the weighing of policies to the situation in the present case?
Yeah, I think, in fact, I think this is comparable to virtually all of the appeal decisions that in the core documents, they all had something site-specific relating to them. I'm not aware there's other ones that have just a points of principle, might not be 100% correct in that, but that's my view, is that they all had an issue, if you like, on the site. And this one is clearly an issue of landscape, a landscape harm, and we don't have that before us.
So with bearing that very point in mind, could you take up the framework paragraph 12, which you were asked about? If it is the case as a matter of construction, and I'll look forward to hearing the council submissions on this, that paragraph 12 is putting some kind of gloss on the statutory test and providing guidance, as opposed to simply saying apply the statutory test. If that is the position, and if in fact what it's saying is other material considerations can't usually outweigh the development plan, there has to be a test of sort of unusualness. How unusual is the present case in terms of its level of impact and its level of benefits?
Very unusual.
Why do you say that?
Because there is no claimed impact or harm put to us other than the conflict with the policy. There's no alleged landscape harm. There's no alleged heritage harm or drainage harm or highways harm. It's purely and simply a point of principle with the council.
Thank you very much. Those are the questions of re-examination still. So just to flag up for you, but I'll deal with the points about SIL regulations in closing, because obviously there's shades of legal matters in that context too. So I won't re-examine on that, if that's okay.
Okay, thank you. Right, okay, well, thank you for that, Mr. Hill. That brings us to the end of the evidence for the appellants and indeed all the evidence. So we're going to have the conditions and planning obligations session, but I'm just looking at my emails. I didn't have the final version of the Section 106 agreement, but it looks like that's now here. Is that right?
Yes, I've seen an email sending it to the case office, so it flashed up on my screen a few minutes ago. So.
Okay, and another version of the SIL compliance statement, Mr. Smythe, is that correct? Has that been updated?
I haven't looked at it, but I saw an email flashing up saying that one has gone to you. So.
Right, okay. I obviously haven't had a chance to look at those yet, given that they've just arrived. So we'll take a slightly earlier lunchtime adjournment at this point so that I can have an opportunity to do that. and then we'll come back and deal with those matters after lunch. So is there anything that anyone wants to raise before we take that adjournment?
Other than, sir, would you be open to a slightly shorter lunch break? Because the sooner we finish today, obviously the sooner we can get cracking on with our closing submissions.
No, I'm afraid not.
Always worth a try. Don't ask, you don't get.
I need to have enough time to be able to read documents and then be able to deal with them. So we will actually take just over an hour and come back at 1 o'clock, please.
Okay, see you then.
Thank you.